Welcome everyone to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the one, the only, the very moony Ayoush Lazikani, who's going to tell us all about her book, The Medieval Moon, which I've read and is absolutely lovely, fantastic. So Ayush, for those who don't know you, please tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. And just to say thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's a real joy. My name's Ayush. I teach at the University of Oxford. I teach Old and Middle English literature. But in my research, I'm more of a globalist. So I particularly look at the relationship between Islamic and Christian literature, particularly mystical Islamic and mystical Christian literature. But in this particular book, The Medieval Moon, that we'll talk about, I've tried to look at many different cultures as well from around the world. So yeah, that's me. So I teach Old and Middle English, but research more broadly.
So The Medieval Moon is your third book. And
That's right.
so what
Yeah.
what got you interested in this particular subject?
Well, how it started really is I was working on my second book that compared Christian and Islamic mystical literature, particularly from the perspective of emotion. And I kept coming across the moon in both traditions in a not in just a passing way, but in a really fundamental way to the literature, where it it seemed to have really deep meaning for the people writing and reading these texts. And I also knew that the moon was very important in various East Asian cultures. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a book that to do a project that looks at the moon from the perspective of different cultures from in the medieval period, because that's what I specialize in, what I feel I know about. So that's really where it started. I found it in both Islamic and Christian sources and linked it to other sources from around the world, and thought to do a project that takes a global perspective of the moon.
So this fascination with the moon really begins with antiquity. So even though your book focuses on the medieval moon, you do mention a few Greek and Roman sources. And so what can you tell us about their fascination with the moon?
Yes, well, we have a moon goddess in Greco-Roman sources, with Diana or Artemis, associated with the moon. Um, we also have interest in traveling to the moon in a text by someone called Lucian of Samosata, which is antiquity. So pre-medieval. Um, we have a lot of interest in the idea of the moon as feminine. I believe in antiquity. I'm not a specialist in antiquity, so apologies for any mistakes. But the moon is very central to a lot of belief in the Greco-Roman period and in other pre-medieval societies as well.
The Greek story of Samosata is very interesting because it's the against the Moonite people and the Sunite people. There's some kind of war that's going on between them.
That's right, yes. So travelers are caught in a storm that flies them upwards and they land on the moon. And they realize that there's this war going on between, as you say, the moon knights and the sun knights. And it's a war that in the end is solved by forming a kind of eclipse. A war that's solved by forming a kind of eclipse. And interestingly, we're told that people on the moon, that actually men give birth through the calves of their legs. So it's yeah, a very interesting, peculiar story.
I love that. It's fantastic. Your book really starts out with two specific sources. You start out with the Ming Dynasty and you start out with a 12th century English monk. Why two? I mean, the book covers from around 700 to around 1600. But why cover those two specific sources as your beginning?
Well, it was really the images that I discovered where we have two figures gazing on the moon, one an English source, one from the Ming Dynasty in China. And I thought it really encapsulates what I hope we would be, me and readers would be doing in the book, which would be gazing on the moon to study it, to try and understand it, to let our imaginations flow freely. So I found those two images, they seemed to complement each other so well, although they came from completely different time periods, completely different cultures, no sense that the illustrators would have had any contact with each other at all. But it read this idea of gazing at the moon and having this fascination with the moon, I found really compelling.
So the subtitle is the moon haunts and blesses. So who feels haunted by the aspect of the moon and who feels blessed by the aspects of the moon?
Yeah, so I came up with this idea of, yeah, haunting and blessing because the moon has in medieval cultures around the world has as we might expect both a positive and a negative aspect. But in particular, the moon, we have it associated with falseness, inconstancy, brokenness, grief. So it is a kind of haunting. But on the other hand, we have it associated with fertility, with joy, with miracles. So it is a kind of blessing. So the moon has this myriad of meanings depending on the culture, but also within a particular culture, like in medieval English culture and literature, there might be really negative associations of the moon, like we find in Chaucer or the Middle English poem called Pearl. But there might also be very positive associations with the moon, um, like the moon associated with fertility and joy that we see in, for example, medieval saints' lives.
So who was it that decided that the moon was a planet? Because they did have this wide belief at the time that the moon was its own planet, not that it was a moon of us.
Yes, so probably a lot of this idea comes from Ptolemy, the moon as a planet, because he was very deeply influential on medieval ideas of what the moon was. So yes, the pervading idea in a lot of regions, like in Europe and in Islamic regions, is that the moon was a planet and was in particular the planet closest to the Earth. So I think the order was the moon. Um, sorry, I always confuse them. The moon, Mercury, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, etc., and Saturn. So that was the order. So the moon was closest to the Earth, and that meant that it had a very intimate relationship with Earth and people on it. And we see a lot of sources that, for example, talk about the moon influencing the tides,
Mhm.
influencing the growth of trees, influencing human bodies and minds.
And so, but the moon is not only a planet. There's also the moon is an animal, is for many different cultures. You'd mentioned that the moon sometimes becomes a rabbit, like it does for the autumn festival. But you also mentioned something called chasing and or tricking the wolf or chasing the elephant. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so these are stories, medieval stories, in which the moon has an illusory role, a role in illusion and trickery. So in Kalila and Dimna, which is an animal, a series of animal stories that was translated into many different languages. It has sources, I believe, ultimately from various Indian traditions, um, and then is translated into Persian, Arabic, Spanish. But I particularly look at the Spanish version. I'm sorry, the I particularly look at the Arabic version. In this story, the rabbits are are overcome by elephants coming to their land, and they want the elephants to go away. So they decide to trick the elephants and say that the moon is wants them to leave. And so the rabbit says, if you play with the water with your trunk, you'll see that the moon is shivering in rage, and that causes the elephants to become afraid and run away. So we see there the moon involved in illusion and trickery. Um, in another from a very different time period and culture, a fable by older Scots poet Robert Henryson. He talks about a fox tricking the moon, tricking a wolf by looking at a reflection of the moon and mistaking it for cheese.
So is that where the idea that the moon is made of cheese comes from?
I don't know, it might well be, who knows?
But there is also a man on the moon. And who is the
Mm.
man with thorns on his back?
Yes, so this is a tradition we find in various European languages like English and German and Dutch. But in particular, we have an English poem surviving from the early 14th century, in which a man is banished to the moon. This is a story that, as I say, we find across various regions of Europe. But he is banished to the moon for collecting thorns in order to form a hedge to prevent livestock from roaming. Um, and in this poem, we have a person on Earth actually call out to the man on the moon who's given a name. He's called Hubert. He calls out to Hubert, but the man on the moon can't hear him because the person on Earth really wants to help him, but Hubert can't hear. And so we end with this kind of lack of communication between the man on Earth and the man on the moon.
And there's other people on the moon as well, or rather, people come from the moon. There's Princess Kaguya, who's there, and also but in certain traditions, like you say in Tibet, the moon is a king, or is there's a king on the moon.
Yes, so in the the tale of Kaguya-hime, the tale of the bamboo cutter, um, from late ninth, early 10th century Japan, we have this what I find a beautiful story of a moon princess who comes to dwell on Earth for a time. She's exiled to Earth and she's cared for by human parents who raise her. But in the end, she has to go back to the moon, and it's a very painful separation between her and her adoptive earthly parents. But yes, in other traditions, so in various traditions in South Asia, we have this idea of King Moon, who suffers from a wasting disease because he obsesses over a particular star rather than going to all the stars. He obsesses with one particular star and ends up wasting away. And it's not until the balance is restored and he visits all the stars that his health is restored.
And people, I mean, even though they seem to make different analogies for why the moon is waxing and waning, they understood a lot more about the moon than we probably think they did. They knew about eclipses, and obviously they knew that the world was round. That whole idea of the world being flat comes from the 1600s. So what else did they know at that time about the moon that maybe we think that they didn't think that they knew?
Yeah, so they were a lot of people were aware that the moon reflects the light of the sun, for example. Not everyone was. There's some sources that talk about the moon generating its own light, but the idea that the moon reflects the light of the sun, we find that. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea of the moon influencing the tides was a very prevalent idea in this period as well. You mentioned eclipses. There's so many sources that talk about both solar and lunar eclipses, and really understanding the mechanisms by which that happens.
There are quite a few sources that talk about the moon as a fickle or a changeable object.
Mm.
And so why is it that in some cultures we have that aspect of the moon that it seems to be fickle or changeable?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder if it's because of that the changing form of the moon that it inspires this idea of change and fickleness and something that's not stable. We find that idea in Old English riddles. We find it in Chaucer's poetry, like the Franklin's Tale, the idea of moon as illusory. Um, we find it in, yeah, the Middle English poem Pearl that talks about, well, we presume a father's grief for his infant daughter who's died. And he talks a lot about being trapped under the moon's light. And by that, he means more broadly the changeability that the moon represents, the changes that are painful for us on Earth.
We also have this obviously the idea that the moon can cause some kind of illness or disease, and the lunatic
Mm.
shows up in the late 13th century. But why did what evidence did they have that they think that the moon was responsible for changing people?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I I wonder sort of what specific evidence they had. I mean, it's this in general, we have this idea that um, people are cha can be changeable with the moon, that there are some people who might have a particularly sensitive temperament and be susceptible to the moon, and therefore suffer from a malady of lunacy, as it was understood for a long time. Um, where they got that idea from, I'm not sure, but it has pre-medieval roots, and we find it expressed in medieval texts as well. Um, and there we might talk about this later, but also there's a lot of emphasis on the moon's position as affecting one's physical health as well. So there was this pervasive idea, probably ultimately coming from classical or pre-Christian, pre-medieval. I was thinking of the English context, of the moon's position as influencing, for example, the prognosis of an illness, when you should undertake treatment like bloodletting. All of that was influenced by the moon's position in a particular star sign at any given moment.
And like my boy Simon Foreman, who who was very who was very serious about the planets. I noticed that as well. You included in your book one of the places where it shows that the zodiac and how it affects certain parts of the body. But why did they think that well, there's the moon that affects the health, but they also did healing by the moon. Why did they think that the zodiac or the planets could somehow correspond to different body parts?
Yeah, it was this idea called melathesia that was a concept that suggested that in, particular star signs or particular zodiac signs influence particular parts of the body or were linked to particular parts of the body. So, Aries was linked to the head, for example. And so, if the moon was in that sign, you needed to be careful about undertaking treatment in that part of the body. So, if it was in Aries, you wouldn't want to do treatment on the head, because the head would be particularly susceptible to the influence of the moon and various potential negative outcomes because of that.
Yeah, selenomancy is quite old, but it's interesting how this sort of idea of moon magic kind of really and planet magic in general really took off in Europe in the Middle Ages. There was a great
Mm.
fashion for it. And people really did do, like you said, they used the moon as a healing aspect as well when they wrote down to do certain things by the phases of the moon. What did it
Mm.
mean to be born under certain phases of the moon?
It could mean all sorts of things. If you were born under a certain phase of the moon, it would influence w- how you would turn out. So there's one example. I can't remember this specific phase of the moon, but under that particular phase of the moon, someone born on that time will end up being a brawler and be really riotous and a troublemaker. Um, it could influence if you beyond when you were born as well. It could influence, or they believed it influenced the impact or the outcome of a journey you took. So you had to be careful of the exact position of the moon in order to undertake a journey, because the outcome could be good or bad depending. If you were imprisoned, the phases of the moon could indicate whether or not you would ever be released. So they had, yeah, amazing weight placed on the moon and all it could do, depending on its age or its position.
By extension, how did the moon and moonlight become entrenched in alchemy?
Yeah, so this probably again has ancient roots. Um, But what we find in medieval sources is that the alchemical sciences and the astrological and or astronomical sciences are deeply intertwined, and their symbolism becomes deeply intertwined. And in this alchemical process, the moon is especially associated with silver, whereas the sun is associated with gold. So you couldn't really separate alchemy from astrology and astronomy. The two or three fields were deeply intertwined.
Moon was also used as a source of prophecy. So what prophecies
Mhm.
do we see that were foretold by the moon?
Yes, so we have in some of the examples I gave about the imprisonment and journeys, we have lots of predictions based on the moon in so-called moon books or lunaria. But in other traditions, so for example, if we look at Islamic traditions, there's a miracle attributed to Muhammad or God of the splitting of the moon. And that was seen as a potent sign potentially of the hereafter, what was to come after death. Um, Moving back to England, we have a text called the Letter of Alexander to Aristotle, an Old English text that has different versions in later periods and other languages. But there we have the tree of the moon and a tree of the sun, and those trees can give prophecies depending on the sunlight or the moonlight. So we have this, yeah, this real fascination with the moon as being able to predict future events or predict the outcomes of certain actions.
Think it's interesting that the people or the texts that deal with the moon as being a person are not necessarily the same text that deal with the moon as being a romantic companion or a romantic partner. It seems like those two ideas are very separate. So where do we get this idea that the moon is somehow a romantic companion?
Yeah, it's found in so many varied sources, so I'd find it difficult to pinpoint an origin, but we find in, for example, a 13th century text by a Japanese woman, Abutsu. She undertakes a journey through moonlight, and in that, the moonlight remains this kind of friend or companion, not necessarily romantic
Hmm.
companion, but definitely a kind of companion. But when we come to, for example, Arabic and Persian poetry, we have this. pervasive image of the beautiful one being a moon, being as beautiful as the moon. And so, by extension, your loved one would be as beautiful as the moon. And so, we have this rich tradition of love poetry where the beloved person is described as a moon or the moon or multiple moons. Um, and we even find beyond Arabic traditions, we about Arabic and Persian traditions, we even find this idea in a Welsh poet Dafydd ap Gwilym, who talks about the moon both as again the lovely, beautiful or loved one being as uh, as gorgeous as the moon, but also talks about the moon as flooding a rendezvous, a romantic rendezvous with its light, and therefore thwarting the secret encounter between lovers. So this association of the moon with love is very widespread, but reaches a particularly powerful crescendo, as it were, in Persian and Arabic poetry in the medieval period.
Oh, it's really wonderful. I love this book so much. What are you going to be working on next, if not the moon?
Yeah, I've got two projects in mind. So one is looking at anchoritic literature, so literature written for religious recluses, but particularly from the angle of environmental studies and critical animal studies. So looking at the role that the environment and animals had for religious recluses, because we might think they were completely sealed off from the world, and in many ways they were. But the environment and the natural world and animals still had a potent role in their lives. So that's one project. The other one, I'm hoping to look at women in the Islamic world, a kind of general history from the 8th to the 19th century. So quite wide ranging, but I hope will be interesting for a general audience and who want to find out more about women in Islamic societies.
Well, I hope you'll come back and talk to us about those. But for now, for everybody who hasn't read this, The Medieval Moon, A History of Haunting and Blessing is out everywhere now. So you have no excuse not to go and get it. It's fantastic, very affordable. Because whenever we do these, sometimes people say, "Oh, is it an academic press?" Sometimes they could be quite expensive, but this is a very
Yeah.
affordable volume. So Ayush, thank you so much for being here and for talking about this book. It was really such a treat, and I really loved it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been such a joy being able to talk with you.